Peace, peace. I think I had a little delay, but welcome everybody to another podcast and book club. I am Ikemba of We Charge Colonialism, one of the writers and researchers. Oh, can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Do
Yeah.
you done introducing yourself?
Oh, y'all didn't hear me introduce myself. Oh, am I done? Yes, I'm done. I'm done. Go ahead.
Peace, everyone. I'm Natasha. I am a member of WCC, member of the Northeast Political Prisoners Coalition, and I'm also an educator and community organizer.
Peace, everyone. This is Frank, host for the Revolutionary Repatriation Educational Lecture Series.
All right, all right. And we are your team. I'm like Malcolm X. You know, Malcolm X said, "Make it plain." So I just make it plain. But yeah, welcome everybody to another podcast and book club. Hey, you guys, make sure that you're liking the podcast. Make sure that you're sharing the podcast, so people can get some of this information, some of this powerful knowledge that we're propagating right now. So, I want to appreciate everybody for tuning in weekly. If this is your first time, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you subscribe to We Charge Colonialism. Make sure you go to our website, wechargecolonialism.org, and keep up to date with the work that we're doing. We are a grassroots think tank. Baba Dr. Amerson Wilson says that we need think tanks in our community, right? So we're just carrying on the mission of one of our great thinkers and leaders, Dr. Amerson N. Wilson. People, hey, I gotta let it be clear. I always say his initial, Dr. Amos N. Wilson. Sometimes I confuse people because they be like, Amerson? That's his name? That's just a habit of mine. So appreciate y'all for tuning in. Uhuru to everyone. And make sure too, when you subscribe, Frank, he does a podcast on Friday. We're gonna get a name for that podcast, man. Frank speaks or Frank talks or something, but he addressed Europe and the EU and the United States sabotage of Haiti. Check it out. That was, if you didn't tune in yesterday to see that, make sure that you check that podcast out for sure. Tomorrow, Sunday at 9 p.m., I'll be covering Dr. Amerson Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. So tune into that. And then Monday, make sure you tune in at 7 o'clock. We have a political prisoners segment brought to us by the December 12th movement, who's based in Brooklyn. So check that out on Monday. But subscribe so you can make sure you get these updates. So this is our weekly roundup. Today we're going to be starting Dr. Bobby E. Wright's Mentacide, right? So we're going to delve into that. Dr. Bobby E. Wright, another one of our great thinkers. We'll look into that reading in the second half, Mentacide. And as usual, in this first part, we're going to do our weekly roundup. And so we're going to get right into it. We got some interesting stories to bring you guys. I'll do mine really quick. I say really quick, right? But I'm going to pull up. In Florida, they have a problem with African American studies. So I'm going to pull this up so we can look at this story. They rejected the proposal to introduce African American studies into their curriculum. Share this. All right. And this is the guy they talking about running this guy for president, the Republican Party. Interesting people. So be on the lookout for this guy running for president. So Florida rejected a proposed advanced placement course focused on African American studies because it included study of topics like the movement for Black lives, Black feminism, and reparations, according to a list of concerns provided to CNN on Friday by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis' office. So the one-page document prepared by the Florida Department of Education also questions the inclusion of certain Black authors and historians whose writings touch on critical race theory and Black communism, another boogeyman. For example, the state objects to the inclusion of writings by Robin D.G. Kelly, a professor of American history at UCLA, who warns that simply establishing safe spaces and renaming campus buildings does nothing to overthrow capitalism, according to the document. I would stop it there just for the sake of time, but check out there's several articles that are written on this topic of this rejection of African American studies. And what this does for me, it just goes to show, first of all, we're receiving a colonial education from the very beginning when we start sending our children to the schools, these institutions that has been propped up and controlled by the very people who colonized and enslaved Africans, right? So we can't expect a education for liberation, education for liberation, for revolution. The education of the colonizer is to sustain the status quo. And so this history, even though it will be beneficial to, everybody, but particularly African people, we should be centering ourselves in the story, especially when we're receiving an education that's unbalanced and that has been through the lens of the European, through the lens of white people, through the colonizer. So it's very important that we bring some balance to it, and particularly in these schools that are predominantly African, predominantly Black. It should be centered. They should be learning this stuff, right? But as we can see, that there's still a segment in this society that do not want the liberation of African people. They don't want us to center ourselves. They don't want us to learn the true history of this nation. Because if we receive that education, our mindset will be, we have to transform the system, or we have to do something better for ourselves, because we can't rely on these institutions that's propped up by these people who have historically done things against our best interests. So I know you guys have some thoughts. I'm gonna leave it there.
Yeah, just to add in a little bit, I think also to bringing in and thinking about colonialism and how the United States is a settler colony in general, right? It's a settler nation that it was founded on coming to the U.S. and coming to what is now the U.S. and creating a country on land that is not theirs. And so therefore having to create this false narrative of even how America came to be. So we know we have this false story of America as an immigrant nation that came to be, and Europeans having to, having found this country in order for them to be free, and that this is a nation that is built on freedom. So we know that whole false narrative that's propped up so that people can internalize it and also therefore defend and want to always keep the country the way that it is, that false narrative is always being protected. So in order for them to protect that narrative, they're going to refuse to include the real history of the U.S. that shows the way in which it has used and abused and violated the rights of African people, and not want to tell the stories of that, but also wanting to tell the stories of the real contributions that African people even made to the U.S. And even how the U.S. is built on the free labor of African people, which gets to reparations, on the forced free labor. So I think all of that is, we know that the United States is always going to protect its interest, right? And so its interest is, whether it's internationally or domestically, it's always going to protect this interest when it comes to protecting this false story and the false narrative and the myth of what the United States is. And I think they're never going to stop trying to not have our real history, and the history of African people within schools. And so I think it's a little bit of two things where we know this is a continuation. In order for the U.S. to be able to maintain itself, it needs to maintain this false story, so that you're going to have Europeans propping up this false story here in America, these Euro Americans propping up this story, these false narratives. And I think that while they're doing that, we also can continue to challenge and push for our stories to be told, because we know that's how they started getting told in the first place, that we pushed and challenged even so. And so I think like that's the two things that I take from that story, is the one that they're never going to stop. So we have to realize that and be really clear that they're never going to stop trying to make sure we don't have our stories in the schools. But we know that in the meantime and in between time, until we build our own institutions, that we're in these schools. So we still have to push as communities to fight against them fighting against us.
Yeah. I mean, God forbid that in school they're learning about the reparations movement, right? Or even Black Lives Matter, that movement, that whether you agree, disagree, was a major movement, that took place as a result of police brutality. It seems like any type of resistance, a history of resistance that we have to the oppression and exploitation of African people, they don't want to talk about. Like, I mean, I didn't learn about there's a reparations movement that goes all the way back to the 19th century into the 20th century with Kali House, right? We don't learn about this person. We don't learn about reparations movement that goes back over 100 years, among other things. But Frank, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, in adding to what you guys just said already, I think one there are a few things that I'm going to borrow from Natasha, like what she said, European American. So we're going to give them names too, so they are not American. So there are a few things that the European American who call themselves American are actually afraid of. So one thing they are afraid of is being guilty. So they know that the moment you teach the African history, that's going to bring guilt to them, and they never want to see themselves in a position where they're going to feel guilty and feel horrible about themselves. They never want to see themselves in a position where they will be the one, like the table with 10, they will be the one actually who are actually brutal, who are actually the gang, the rapists, like how they describe Black people as the rapists and all of those things. If African history is to be taught in this country, it's going to make them look bad. It's going to make them look guilty as to what they have done. And another thing they don't want to teach a history is because of the lies they have told about how this country was built on freedom. So if they teach our history, the world going to know that America was never built on freedom, and there have never been freedom, but African people in this country live by surviving. African people have been surviving from time to time in this country. Black people have been surviving, not on freedom. And if the African history is to be taught again, people will get to understand that there is no equality in this country. Black people is not equal to white people. I mean, the list can go on in things. And another thing that will come into existence again is the lie that they have told, because once that story is being taught or are being taught, all right, in the school system here, what's going to happen is the next thing is people are going to go further beyond the story. So then how did African people come into this part of this world? All right. So the story going to go beyond that. African people, it was not the first time that African people came here into this world from the 1600s. People are going to understand that African people have already migrated here. African people have already lived here. African people have already cultivated this land and they own this land. So it's going to go beyond. So it's going to bring out white people as the visitors in this country. And it's going to go beyond even how African people were. So it's going to go beyond the 1600 all the way to Africa, because imagine this is a story that you're going to uncover, you're going to dig. And now, once that's going to happen, it's going to make the so-called Greek, the so-called European philosopher like Socrates, Alexander, the so-called great. So the story is going to go into that, and you're going to see that even those people with their greatness, they learn their greatness actually from Africa. So it's deep. It's deep. What we are looking at here is something that they are hiding, is something they don't want to bring forth because it's deep, and once that happens, it's going to make African people to take their place, to come back where they were, and they don't want that to happen. So in order for that not to happen, they're going to keep suppressing the African story. But again, America have no history if African history are being suppressed.
Hey, I shade to that. Interesting thing, you were talking about the European American and the true American. Did you know that the Europeans considered the Native Americans Americans? So just in the English colony, when they referred to Americans, they were talking about the natives, the indigenous people of this land, and they identified themselves as British. This was before the American Revolution. So it's interesting when you know that history, like they didn't even identify themselves as Americans. They identified the indigenous people as Americans. Then after the break with the British, they began to identify themselves as American and the indigenous people as like the other. Interesting thing. But we can go into the next story. Who's gonna pick? I know we're interested in that chicken story. We're gonna
I'll
go
go
there.
next. Yeah.
All right.
So let me share my screen real quick. Let me share my screen real quick. So my story, the one that I'm sharing this morning, is about a chicken. Schools in Zimbabwe having to sell chickens in order to be able to support the school within itself. And so let me just, I want to say this is the one. Yep. Okay. So I'm just gonna read like just the beginning of the story, just to give you a little bit of what's being said, and then let you know a little bit more about what else is being what else goes into this whole story. So here it says that like since 2019, his school, this brother who they mentioned before, Chinyaka, this Chinyaka high school in Harare, but one of the teachers and some of the teachers, the school in general has sold hundreds of chickens a week at local markets, and they say that when children, the school has also other businesses too. It used the money earned from selling chickens to buy sewing machines, to make face masks, uniforms for schools across the province. And it says its latest schemes are to manufacture bricks and breed tilapia fish. So the reason why they're selling chickens and that they're getting into manufacturing bricks and breeding tilapia and making masks is because, as it says here on this next part of the article, that the education system within Zimbabwe has really declined over the years. And then it goes on to talk about, how the education system has declined over the years because of the way ZANU-PF has ruled within the country. But interestingly enough, what it doesn't mention is the sanctions that have been imposed upon Zimbabwe that has affected the way that there has affected greatly their healthcare system, the education system, and also the way in which the Zimbabwe, for US and European political reasons, have been hindered from being able to borrow money from the IMF and the World Bank, which have denied in other instances, in the through the over the years of these sanctions, have denied Zimbabwe or blocked them from gaining any or borrowing any type of money, even though that they've repaid a large portion of the debt that they do owe. So along with them having to repay debt and sanctions and also other things that go on within the country politically, Zimbabweans are struggling with education, especially in the rural parts. And so I think that the story brings up a couple of things, and a couple of things that I think about, or that I thought about when reading it, was one, the way in which we see the school doing these things in order to provide for itself. And it talked about how the school has many different businesses. And so I thought one thing that I thought about was this is an example of how, even though we know that the situation isn't ideal, this is not how we want the school to be able to sustain itself, because the country is supposed to be providing free education. It's part of its constitution that it will provide free education. And so right now, really, it seems that only the rich can afford to educate their children within Zimbabwe. But I will say that, one of the things I think when we're always thinking about solutions is look at the ways in which, one, it's funding the school, in terms of understanding the idea of creating streams of income and revenue outside of that. And I think that's one thing that, even when we think about independent African-centered institutions within the US, is something that we always have to do, because when you're educating yourself in a colonial system, which we're doing here within the US, and Zimbabwe is doing in their country, because we know we're still under colonization, that African people are going to have to find ways to be able to support their own education. Now, obviously, it shouldn't be so in that particular kind of way in Zimbabwe, an African country. But we know that because of the different facets of colonialism that we've been put into these places, where even our own governments within Africa aren't doing their just due when it comes to education. We were just talking about how Florida is trying to block education, African education and history from African people here in the US. And we know that also the countries within Africa depend on aid from other countries in order for them to be able to provide education. And so I think that also goes back to how we are hindered through education, because we're depending on other outside sources to be able to fund our educational systems, to even be able to fund our economies. So when we talk about Africa, outside agencies, IMF, World Bank, other countries and organizations that are not African coming in and funding these educations. And we know those, so whoever's going to fund your education can also dictate what you get to teach. So I think that there's a lot to be said about this particular situation, and also a lot to be learned, I think, too, in terms of how do we finance our own education, but also what kind of what does education for us look like? Are we trying to build an equivalent to the European institutions that we have here? How are we rethinking education the same way people are rethinking when it comes to the environment? We need to be rethinking education for us and moving away from this European way of doing education. And I think that might be a way in which Zimbabwe and other African countries can get away from having these issues with funding within their countries for education, if they start to think about education in a different way, education as it relates to African people pre-colonialism.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as you were speaking, there were a few things that jumped out to me. Just really quickly, the institutions of the IMF and the World Bank, right? These international institutions that has been propped up by the colonizers. It's very important to think about these institutions who are put in. Then you have the World Trade Organization, but these institutions that are not investing, but giving these loans to these developing nations that are impoverished nations because of colonialism. So the very people who created these institutions that's supposed to help out the former colonies are institutions that has been created by the people who created the problem in the first place. And then when we think about the policies, the way that these economic institutions work, these international economic institutions, that's part of this world order, is that its policies are dictated by the colonizers in particular, because it's a weighted voted system. So when it's weighted, it's the larger economies in the world have the most say in the policies of those institutions. So we're talking about the United States, France, Germany, Britain, these countries, who else? But these European nations, Belgium, these nations are the ones who have the most say, European nations. in the direction of the IMF and the World Bank. So they're influencing the economic policies of the African nations who are borrowing these resources from the very people who colonized them in the first place. So it's, you know, it's a sad situation. So we can't normalize this. I'll leave it here open, give it to you, Frank, but we can't normalize this contradiction. You know, we can't adjust to this system. It has to be overturned.
Yeah, I mean, you guys said it. I just want to add another piece of it. I mean, it sounds very logical that these professor or the school, they are doing all these things to bring education to the kids or to the public and to raise finance and things. So it's like they are taking matter into their own hands, which is very encouraging. Making farms and all of those things, right? But also I just want to add to it as well that I think if they are doing those things, they should be fair in it too. They shouldn't do it to exploit those kids in our school. Because again, I know it's Africa. Sometimes for me, I like to go Hajj. Okay. Yeah. So they shouldn't do it to exploit those kids, because in Africa, most people do it. They use things to exploit the kids, and then they get the finances and then put it into their own private businesses and so forth. And then the kids will be in our area suffering and nothing better. So if they are doing those things, which is fine, but please let them use the finance that they will get from that to improve on the school, to improve on our equipments and so forth and things. They shouldn't do that and then get the capital and then use it for their own personal gain. So I just want to bring that in there as we are discussing this, to also remind those professors that you guys are doing a great job, but equally so, do not use that as a means to raise money for yourself, because the country is high. You may not be getting paid from the government or from whatsoever institution that need to pay how they call it, teachers or principals and so forth, right? Don't use that as a means to exploit those kids, because they depend on you as well. So if you are getting money from farming and things, and from the labor of those kids, they want to learn, and that's why they are there, to labor. So please use that money back into the school system.
You want to jump into your story?
Oh yeah, sure. So there's a story here. I just want to talk about it, but I want to actually put her face, her Europeanness face, or her European American face here. So I'm going to bring that. Let me see here. So is this lady? She went to Ghana for vacation. She went to Africa for vacation. This lady right here. She's a religious person again. So I'm going to bring that. That's why I thought to bring it out. So, so right here, I'm going to read down here a little bit. So what she's saying. Sorry, hold on. Okay, so she said, she said she claimed to have learned a lot from Ghanaian culture and will at some point run it down. So let me see. So she said, okay, a video I made. So this is just talking. A video I made talking about my experience in Ghana. We are taken completely out of content. And there are many upset people from Ghana, which break my heart, because I love and respect the people of Ghana and their beautiful country so much. So what does he say that people are taking it out of context is what I want to read here. So this is what she said, and now people react, or people are reacting to her, and then she said they are taking it out of context. So what does he say that people are taking it out of context? Let's see what she said. So in the video, so after she visited Ghana and then she came back to her so-called America, and then she began to go on Instagram to make a video. So in this video, she said she referred to Ghanaian as poverty, stinking, hungry, and loving in faith. Now, faith also means disgusting. So she was referring to African people as disgusting people, all right? Hungry people, poverty and stinking people. So this is what she said, and people reacted to it, and then she's saying that they're taking her word out of content. How is this word or these words spoken by you, people taking it out of content, you calling people disgusting, stinking, dirty, and then they react to it, you say they're taking it out of content. So let me just remind her, just because in America here, people take the good parts and put it on media and show it to the world, that doesn't mean that there is no stinking, dirty, and disgusting part in America here. The 50 states in America here, all 50 states have stinking, dirty, and disgusting area. Okay, so that's how to Africa look like. There are disgusting area, there are stinking area, and there are beautiful area. So you went in Ghana, enjoy the people culture, enjoy the people civilization, have fun, have life, and you came back, you said nothing about what you learned, what you enjoy, but came back and sat down on your social media and began to put your stinking mouth on the people, describing them as they are disgusting, they are dirty. No, woman, you white woman, if you don't know, you are the one who is disgusting and stinking and dirty because you don't take shower. You are very disgusting. African people started taking shower before you came from the Caucasus Mountain. So please, we don't even need you on our continent again. That alone, not even to talk about Ghana. We don't need you on the African continent. How dare you go and discuss people like that? And then when they react to it, and then you say they're taking your word out of content. What word have been taken out of content? You go and read that again if that have been taken out of content. So that is just what I want to say here to her.
Hey, you said it all. Great point. Ride the Philadelphia trains, and you're gonna see that you can make them same comments. But that's the thing. That's the history. Sometimes I show my students this Sesame Street episode where they're showing this African community. It's a small village, and when it comes on, it says this is Africa, and they show this little girl brushing her teeth with her finger, like going to school, no shoes on, which isn't it's not an issue. I get the students to understand, like, hey, living like this is not the problem, but to make it like this is all of Africa, and coming from a Western view, you're going to look at that and say, oh, African people are poor. African people, they don't have electricity. They don't wear shoes. They don't do this. Instead of, just narrowing it down to that one community in Africa. But they don't go to Europe. They don't go to the United States and go to the projects and say, this is the United States. And they're in the projects and they're showing, just the worst parts of the US. So, but that's the media propaganda, media manipulation that has been used since the very foundation of this European empire. Tasha, you have any thoughts on that?
Quickly, just a few. I agree with Frank. Like, you made an apology and saying you loved it so much and you're gonna bring your daughter back. We don't want you back. African people don't want you coming back. So don't say that. You can make whatever apology you want, but don't go back. Like, you were not, like, nobody wants you back. But I also think that, or in addition, when we're to the point that you and Frank and Ikemba made, what was it, like 50 or 60 years ago, where it was just 50, 60 years ago where New York looked like, I don't even know what. Like, the New York that we see today is not the New York that we know was happening in the 70s and the 60s. Like, it was slums, and we know that it was slums for a long time, and that's just one particular thing. Even when we think about California today, they have a whole tent city with tons and tons and tons of homeless people. And what is the reason why these people would be living in these conditions, even here within the United States. It goes back to the, to colonialism, to America, the way this whole globalization, the way that Europeans are basically sucking out of every other country that is not European, and using their money and their wealth and their resources to build up the places where they live, and then use other places that are non-European as places where they can dump their trash, meaning where they can dump all of, even when we think about the way that we live, where do we think, all of the extra, clothing from, fast fashion, where do we think those things go? Where do we think, when we throw out our computers and cell phones and all, where do you think all of those things are going? They're going to non-European countries. So I think that, like, as we said, every country has its dynamics. You could see that here in the United States. And so to go over to Africa and come back, right, to go over to Ghana and come back and have those things to say, as Frank said, and not talk about what you learned and the culture and all that other stuff, shows the white supremacist mentality of the woman who went over there to come back, to go to another country, to come back and say those things, knowing quite well the same history and current state of Europeans, in those particular instances that she pointed out, as Frank highlighted.
Hey, Ashe. So that's our weekly roundup. I hope, we were able to inform. Well, I know we were informing, educating. Appreciate everybody that's continuing to tune in. Hey, if you just joining us, make sure you like, share. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe, so we can get our viewership up. The power is in the people. As many people as we can get to subscribe to the channel and be a part of this education and this process for liberation and self-determination, the quicker that we can bring a conclusion to these conditions that African people are living under. So we're going to transition to our promo, and then we'll get into our reading for today. All right. We was good with the promo. I got internet connection, so we smooth. All right, cool. So that was our promo for the Black Power Fund. So what is the Black Power Fund? We believe the benefits of community gardening is an increase of food security. Gardening is not only a boost for physical health, but for our mental health as well. Gardening reduces anxiety, depression, and stress. So the objective of this fund is to support community projects that are addressing the food security needs of African peoples. Colonialism has stripped the ability and freedom of the masses of Africans to produce for themselves. The Black Power Fund was created to address this contradiction. So if you know any people who are gardeners, farmers, make sure that you make them aware of the Black Power Fund. They can apply this February and receive a sweepstake which will support their continuing gardening and farming. So make sure you visit our website, wechargecolonialism.org, to be able to apply for the Black Power Fund. All right. So with that being said, we're going to get into the second part of our podcast. We're reading Dr. Bobby E. Wright's Mentacide this week. And just a little background on Dr. Bobby E. Wright, if you're not familiar with his work. This brother was born in Alabama, moved to Chicago in 1982, where he was an American clinical psychologist, scholar, educator, political activist, and humanitarian. He received his BSc in education, MSc in counseling from Chicago State University, and his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Chicago in 1972. At the point of his untimely death, he was president-elect of the Association of Black Psychologists, and he transitioned at the age of 48 in 1982. And so two of his scholarly works have been described as highly influential by the 2013 National Conference on African Black Psychology. The Psychopathic Racial Personality, published in 1974 and republished in 1984, and Mentacide. And we're going to look at both of these works. Mentacide is the ultimate threat to Black survival. That was published in 1979. So both of these works we're going to look at. Another important thing I want to, this last point, his work emphasized the need to recognize psychological racial warfare and for Africans to define themselves in their terms while analyzing the psychology of white supremacy, not only of its victims, and to develop a durable social theory and associated institutions to change the politics of mental health. All right. So with that being said, let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen so folks, there should be a link for you guys to download and read along, but I'm also going to share my screen and we're going to jump right into it. All right, Mentacide, The Ultimate Threat to the Black Race by Dr. Bobby Wright. There's no denying that the entire world is in crisis and all cultures are being transformed, seemingly without direction. Further, it is extremely difficult to identify a stable, unified belief system for any racial or ethnic group except for one overt, incontrovertible exception, namely the anti-Black racial groups. However, the anti-Black character is not the cause of world turmoil. It is simply a major factor, and at this point in time, it is only important to the Black race. Without any elaborate research, design being necessary, the world crisis can be traced directly to the pathological needs of one group, the white race, regardless of their ethnicity. Never in the history of the universe has the destiny of so many been controlled by so few. The white subjugation of the Black race and the control of their land is an essential ingredient in contributing to their insatiable, morbid, predatory appetite for world domination. In view of the above, the Black race is presently facing an enemy whose method of destruction is without any historical precedent, namely Mentacide, which is defined as the deliberate and systematic destruction of an individual or group's mind. Mentacide differs in theory and practice from concepts such as brainwashing, and that its ultimate aim is the extirpation of an entire race, whereby brainwashing is primarily used to convert individuals or groups to a cause or belief. No serious scientist today who has any rudimentary understanding of human behavior questions the fact that there now exist techniques which can be utilized to control brain phenomena and in the process eliminate chance behavior, or more succinctly, establish a law which can be stated very simply. He who controls minds controls behinds. There is one essential condition in order for the process of Mentacide to be effective, namely the control of the opposing groups, institutions, or the power to significantly influence them. Unfortunately for the Black race, that condition exists through the world. In fact, some Black groups, such as those of the United States and of Azania, also known as South Africa erroneously, are enslaved rather than being oppressed, exploited, etc., and that all their life-sustaining institutions are controlled by whites. There is no denying that there are whites who are oppressed and exploited by other whites, but they are still able to significantly influence institutional change. The technique of Mentacide deludes Blacks into believing that there is a commonality between them and oppressed whites, which leads Blacks to attempt to form alliances with them. Yet in spite of historical failures of these alliances to benefit Blacks, they continue to pursue this process. Unfortunately, Blacks will continue to utilize white-directed techniques in attempting to solve their problems and will continue to be unsuccessful until they can develop a Black social theory. There's an African proverb that tells the traveler of life that if you don't know where you are going, then any road will get you there. Without a social theory, all behavior, even if it is considered revolutionary, operates by chance or by external direction, and no group at this competitive time in history whose basic defense is faith in the Lord, or white folk, or any other forms of superstition will continue to exist. A social theory determines the destiny of a people by establishing guidelines of life, such as it defines their relationship with other living things. It defines values and rituals, methods of education, how enemies are to be dealt with, etc. The ultimate achievement of a Black social theory would be the recreation of Black culture. The eminent Black, well, I'll read this. I think let's build on what I read so far, and then I'll get into the rest of this section. Any thoughts? I know a lot stand out. I'm gonna open it up to you guys because I know it's a lot.
I'm gonna jump in because I do have to jump off at 11 today. So I think one of the things that stood out, just a few things. I'll say like two. So his quote about if you don't know, I mean the African proverb about if you don't know where you are going, then any road will get you there. And then I'll go back to the other part. But so like that I think is something that we need to just like sit on and think about for a long time, you know, when we're thinking about our movements and what we're doing. As he said, you know, he doesn't feel at that time that, and you know, even still today, because we know that even though he's talking about at that time when he was writing that there weren't, you know, too many groups that he felt were doing that. I mean, when we know about the attack that happened on all of our organizations and groups that happened back then, we can think today and say like, okay, just like if there weren't any then, there aren't any now. And to think about like, okay, if we do think there are some today, what are we measuring it by, you know, as he talks about, because we don't want to be taking any road because we're unsure about exactly where, you know, where we need to go, because we haven't established, as he said, he talks about a social theory that would recreate Black culture. And I think that's where, you know, thinking about indigenous African cultures, thinking about re-Africanization, and as Amilcar Cabral said, you know, culture as a weapon in the fight for liberation, and that understanding that imperative. Because yeah, if you don't have a succinct culture, if you don't have a succinct world view that guides you as a people, there's going to be something that fills that gap. So if you don't have your own culture, and if you're not taking on African culture and ways of being and seeing and knowing, then you're going to take on something else, because you're not going to remain, you know, with no way to operate within the world, with no way to see and understand the world. And so we know that part of the way that we live now is by having taken on ways of European ways of knowing and seeing the world, and interacting with everything that we see in the world. So I think that those two things really stick out to me, because it points to the fact that that's why we keep going in these same circles, because we don't have an established understanding of Black culture. We don't have like an established social theory around that. Now they are out there, obviously, you know, we can go back to them and adopt them when we're thinking about the work that our ancestors have done, and even the work that we still do today in thinking around these questions. But the vast majority of African people in the US or in the Caribbean or on the continent have not decided to take that, but that's part of the anti-Blackness that we've internalized.
Yeah, I agree. That particular quote that you said, I definitely want to touch on that because I think that's important. Frank, you wanted to add something? Let's see.
Yeah, sure. So again, like what Natasha said, and we also go back to the book from where he's first begun by saying there have been no time in history where everything, you know, is being or are being controlled by one set of people. All right. So that is just to say is that before again, European came and interfere with the war. That is to say, there were people who were ruling the war and who did not interfere or who did not rule the war by one set of idea, by one set of mindset, by oppressing other people to believe in their ideology. And that is to say, who were those people again? Were Black people, were African people. And until European came in and changed the whole story around with their ideology to rule the world, to brainwash other people to solely believe just in one idea. And he also mentioned about even spirituality or religion as well, again in there, about Christianity as you read, as I was reading this. So just what other books that we have read and they have been saying, this is the same thing. He just followed, elaborated, and in fact, he broke his down clearly that you don't even have to explain it. So he wrote it and even explained it that he's telling all that, look, if we think we're going to ally with the oppressor, okay, and then be free, it's never going to happen. If you think we're going to call the oppressor for us to make peace together, it's not going to happen. Because first of all, why would they want to make peace with us? There's nothing there to make peace with us. We are the one making peace, right? To free ourselves. They are free already. So our freedom also means to them bondage. Our freedom means to them bondage. So why would they want to come and ally with us for us to be free when they are the one that caused the problem, and the problem they cause on us, it is benefiting them. So why would they want to come to make peace with us? So this is why he's saying that we have to go to our own African consciousness. We have to go back to our own African way of thoughts, way of life, and unite and form a very solid, a uniform group with ourselves. If we are finding alliances, it should be an alliance with another African organization who also believe in the ideology of African people being free, all right, not by going to ally with how they call it, the European. So for he make another analysis that even with the poor white, right, the poor white can also influence, okay, the system. Okay, they can influence the system, and what they want for the system to do, the system will do it. The system will look at their circumstances. Why? Because the system feel that even the poor white is part of the system, is part of the race. All right. But with Black people, we cannot influence the system. If the only time the system actually look at Black people, right, it means that if they look at us and try to influence the system that will fit or that will work for Black people, it means it's never going to affect their ideology. Instead, it's not going to make African people to be elevated. We're still going to be down at that bottom, and our system will still be our how do you call it, issue or our circumstances will still be the same. So in our case, he's telling us then there is no freedom there. We have to cut away from these people. We don't have to ally with these people. We have to move on and look at our African consciousness and our African center, how do you call it, ideology to form it. And that's the only way we will be able to move on.
Yeah, I think y'all on point in regards to summing up what Dr. Amos Wilson, Dr. Bobby E. Wright is getting at. The point that you had brought up, Natasha, in regards to the role, it made me think about Nia. One of the Kwanzaa principles is Nia, purpose. And it speaks to us understanding what our purpose and direction is, right? Because in that particular statement or that proverb, if you don't know what road you're going, if you don't know what he said, your destination, let me go back to it, then any road will do. Meaning, like, if you don't have a purpose, you don't have an objective, then you don't, whatever you do in life, whatever path you take, like, you're going to accomplish your goal, which is like nothing, no goal. So, you know, whether it's successful, whether you're succeeding or failing at what you're doing, there's no plan anyway, so it doesn't even matter. But when you have direction, you have a purpose, you can measure whether you're being successful or not. All right. So that's important. And he's making that point in regards to Black people having the social theory and understanding of our conditions, the history and our present conditions, so that we know what we need to do in the direction that we're going as we move forward. But taking a scientific approach. One thing too that stood out, the Mentacide, when he's defining Mentacide and making the distinction between Mentacide and brainwashing. So, you can brainwash somebody to have them think a particular way, to adapt your culture, your values, and so forth, right? Which I think is related to Mentacide. But he's very clear that Mentacide, the objective of Mentacide is the elimination of Black people. And when you think about the system that you think about the way that we are living as Black people under the system of colonialism, you think about the intercommunal violence that takes place, right? The violence that we commit against each other within our communities. Like, how come Black women don't feel safe in their own communities? Like, where are the men at? Like, where is this fear? This is menticidal behavior that he's talking about. When a Black man shoots down another Black man in his own community, that's menticidal behavior. Dr. Amerson Wilson, who wrote the book Black on Black Violence, he calls it Black on Black Violence. He says the psychodynamics of Black self-annihilation in service of white domination, right? So the elimination, the genocidal behavior that is being committed against Black people, whether we're doing it ourselves, it's a result of the system that has been propped up to get us to behave in a particular way. It's menticidal behavior. So that stood out to me as well. And I know we have a few minutes left. And the other thing in regards to what Dr. Bobby E. Wright gets into is he developed a social political model for Black folks, the Black socio-political model. And this model implies that the disability or the problems within the Black community, right, it stems from the failure of the social environment to adjust to the needs of the people with disabilities, rather than from the inability of disabled individuals to adapt to societal demands, right? And it's a Western view of looking at things, but it also speaks to colonialism, though. It speaks to how the system, the problem is always going to be you under the system of colonialism. So you have to adjust and change to the system. The system doesn't need to adjust and change to the defects within society. And so he addresses that problem. So I just wanted to raise that as well. We're going to read another paragraph, or we're going to end. I'm getting into this.
I wish I could stay to read another paragraph.
Read another paragraph?
I said, I wish I could stay to read another paragraph, but I'm definitely going to hop off at 11.
Okay. What about you, Frank? We going to end it, or we going
to? We can read another paragraph and then end it.
Okay. All right. We're going to do one more, folks. We're going to come back, though. We're not finished with Dr. Bobby E. Wright. Because the crazy thing is, like, there's so much more I want to touch on in what we read at this time. So let me get into this next paragraph. He's going to quote, so the eminent Black scientist, Dr. Sheikh Ante Jacques, succinctly placed culture in its proper perspective by stating the following. So we could just build on this quote. I consider culture as a rampart that protects a people, a collectivity. Culture must, above all, place a protective role. It must assure the cohesion of the group. Following this line of thinking, the vital functions of a body of African human sciences is to develop this sense of collective belonging through a reinforcement of culture. This can be done by developing the linguistic facts, by reestablishing the historical consciousness of African and Black people so as to arrive at a common feeling of belonging to the same cultural and historical path. Once this is attained, it will become difficult to divide and rule and to oppose African communities one against the other. Let me just read this paragraph. However, while it's relatively easy to write about the concept of Black social theory and culture, it will be extremely difficult to develop them. The major barrier to the dynamic is that due to the success of Mentacidal techniques, Blacks are now anti-intellectual, anti-theoretical, and ahistorical. We hear this on social media all the time, and it drives us crazy. Yet, in spite of this reality, the Black race has always produced outstanding Black scholars, admittedly with gaps in their theories that can easily be understood when viewed in the context of individuals opposing institutions. So, final thoughts.
Man, that aspect that you just read just further explain that when he talk about the cultural aspect. So what I wrote down here says we became colonized the day we accepted the European way of life. It was the day we became colonized. And we became brainwashed the day we accept the day we deny our own culture, our own history, our own way of life, our own belief, spiritual belief. It was the day we became brainwashed. So, and this is what exactly he's telling us here. What have become of us since we became colonized? What have become of us since we became brainwashed? What have become of us since we deny our own spiritual belief, our own identity, okay, our own culture, our own way of life, and since the day we accepted European way of life, European culture, what have become of us? Look at the African families. Look at the African way of life. Look at our community. Look at our people. Look at our race. Okay? We are disunited. Look at the horrible things that we are doing to ourselves. We have formed ourselves in culture that is not even part of us. And those culture are not even benefiting our race, but destroying our race. All right? Some of those things I don't even want to name here, but look at what have been perpetrated and what we have accepted and make it part of life. What have it done to the African families, to the African race, to the African continent, to the African community? What benefit have it done to us, but rather destroy us? So he's telling us, then, why can't we take a step back and look at our Africanness? What can we take a step back to look at our African culture? What did we do before the 1600? How did we live? Because at that time, he's telling us we had culture, we have way of life, we have civilization. Because the civilization that they brought to us, it is a civilization that have destroyed us, and we accepted it. And up to now, we have gone nowhere. Up to now, those civilizations that they gave us or they brought to us, it oppressed us. It put us to the bottom of society to the extent that every race in this world looked down on the Black race. The Chinese looked down on us. The Caucasian looked down on us. The Japanese looked down on us. We are the least. What have we done? We did nothing but to deny ourselves. We did nothing but to bring brainwash. We did nothing but to accept culture that is not even benefiting us. Those are the things that we have done. So he's telling us, let us look back and see.
Shay, I unite with that. You know, when it comes to culture, when we think about historically, culture is, of course, like culture is the makeup of values, technology, principles, writing, language. All of this makes up a culture, right? And when we think about historically, cultures have been developed the way that Ante Jacques has presented here for survival. Like our culture is established to be able to contend with forces that may cause our destruction, our elimination. So we develop certain types of behaviors and traditions for the benefit and the survival of the group. Within that culture, if you have a culture where you are causing destruction, murder, mayhem, violence, sexual assault, all these type of things against the very people who are a part of your community, then that is influenced by an outside force, and we have to be very conscious of that. That cultures have never been self-destructive. When you have something that is self-destructive behavior, when you adopt self-destructive behavior, it's due to an outside force, and that's because a people are not self-determined. People are not exercising power. They're not exercising sovereignty. So as African people, let's keep that in mind when if we're doing anything that's destructive, mentally, physically, spiritually, however, to our own people, that's mental-cidal behavior, and it is not rooted in African culture, traditions, or psychology. It's rooted in Eurocentrism, is rooted in colonialism, imperialism, rooted in genocidal behavior. We're adopting the culture, and we're adopting the philosophy and theories of a people who want us to behave and act in a particular way. So I'm gonna just leave it there. We're gonna pick back up with Dr. Bobby E. Wright next Saturday. Appreciate everybody for tuning in, being a part of this discussion. Hope that you was able to get something out of it. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed. And so until next time, peace to the family. Black power.